What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and you're watching our college football channel. It's time to look back at each SEC team from 2022 and look at how they did in one-possession games to kind of see what could have been, both for the good and for the bad, and which teams were maybe overrated and underrated this past season based off of, again, those one-score games. And this also can kind of give us an indication as to which teams maybe are overrated going into next season or underrated, and you can kind of see how that plays out. So we'll look back at when we did this last year and kind of compare all of that. So we'll start with the SEC East, and you take a look at last year, the one-score games. Again, this is from 2021. Kentucky jumps out 4-1, tells you maybe they were a little overrated and they underperformed this season. So that one turned out to be a pretty accurate, or at least it did give us a sign of what was to come. Now, Florida, they were 1-4, so you expected maybe a turnaround for the Gators. That did not happen. They were 6-6 again this year. And let's get to those records. Again, these are the records for 2022. You take a look at how these teams did in the one-score games. Georgia 1-0, Tennessee 3-0. Does that mean maybe Tennessee is that team that could have a letdown next year? I think a lot of that will have to do with who their quarterback is. And this doesn't always tell us teams that are going to be better or worse next year. It's just something to look at. I like to look at all these different things as we start to prepare for the breakdowns and really researching the teams next year. With the transfer portal and all of that, the roster has changed so much that I think this really means less and less. But again, it's still fun to look at. You see Kentucky, Florida, both 500 in one-score games. Missouri was 2-4, so they were maybe a team that was underrated this year, and maybe that tells us next year to watch out for Missouri. We'll keep an eye on that. If these teams had won all of their one-score games, Georgia would still have been 12-0. Tennessee would have still been 10-2. South Carolina still would have been 8-4. Kentucky would have been 9-3. Florida could have been 9-3. Again, this is kind of your best-case scenario. This would have been the best-case scenario this season. So Florida and Kentucky could have been 9-3. But look at Missouri all the way down there towards the bottom. But they could have been 10-2. They could have been 10-2. Think about that for a second. What a season that could have possibly been for Missouri. And then Vanderbilt could have made it to a bowl game, so they could have been a little bit better at 6-6, but not really much difference there. If these teams had lost all of their one-score games, well, Georgia would have lost one game. It really wouldn't have changed much. They still would have won the division, still would have won the SEC championship and gone on to the college football playoff. Tennessee, though, you see, they were not that far away from being a 7-5 team, potentially, with all those one-score games. Remember, Pitt was in overtime. If they missed the field goal against Alabama, those are two losses right there that they could have easily had. And then I think also Florida, they had the ball after that onside kick late with a chance to maybe win that game. So, yes, Tennessee, lucky to be 10-2, really. South Carolina could have been as bad as 6-6, but still, worst case scenario, a bowl game, I think that's pretty good. Kentucky could have been 5-7. Florida could have been 3-6. Again, half of their games were one-score games, so it could have been a lot better, could have been a lot worse. Missouri could have been 4-8, and then Vandy could have been 3-9. So there you go. Now, if they split the one-score games, Georgia, so I did it a little bit different this year. If the split turned out to be a half a game, instead of going with a half a game, I'm just going with whatever record is closer to the team's actual record. So that's why you see for Tennessee, like technically theirs would be 8.5 and 3.5, but we're going to round that up to closer to what their actual record was, and we'll say 9-3. South Carolina would have been 7-5. Kentucky still would have been 7-5. Florida still would have been 6-6. Look at Missouri. They would have been 7-5. And Vandy still would have been 5-7. So that kind of puts Missouri up there with South Carolina and Kentucky ahead of Florida, which is interesting. Florida did beat Missouri, but again, when you're looking at the big picture here, and remember, Missouri lost in the non-conference as well. So that's interesting. I guess Florida, they lost to Florida State also. So interesting to look at these numbers again, these records and what could have been for these teams. Let's go to the SEC West now. And you see Alabama, 4-1 in one-score games last season. Tells you maybe they were a little overrated. Coming into this year, they had a down year. So that one proved to be true. Ole Miss, 10-2. They were 2-0 in one-score games. They dropped off a little this year. And then Auburn was a team that was maybe underrated last year, but they did not bounce back. They did not have a better year this year. They were actually worse. So that's interesting there to look at all these numbers again. And now we look to 2022. LSU at the top, then Alabama, and Mississippi State, Ole Miss both at 8-4, Arkansas 6-6, Auburn and Texas A&M at 5-7. How did these teams do in one-score games? LSU was 2-1. They were pretty good. Alabama was 3-2. So 2 years in a row that Alabama had a winning record in one-score games. Mississippi State was 2-0. Ole Miss was 3-2. Arkansas 1-4. So that tells you Arkansas could have very easily had a much different season. Auburn at 2-2, and then Texas A&M, another team that had a rough year in the one-score games, 2-5. And a big reason is because I think they're inexperienced. This was a really young team this year. They're a talented team. I think if people are expecting another 6-6, 5-7 type year from Texas A&M next year, they're going to be surprised, because if they can keep a good bit of that roster together, and I know there's going to be a lot of guys in the portal, but if they can keep a decent amount of that roster intact, I'm telling you, Texas A&M is going to be much better next year, I believe. And so now we go to the one-score games. If they had won them, LSU would have been 10-2. Alabama could have been 12-0, and we all know they were a couple plays away from being 12-0. Mississippi State still would have been 8-4. So they reached their best case scenario. This was the best case scenario for Mississippi State. Ole Miss could have been 10-2. Arkansas also could have been 10-2. So again, this is an Arkansas team that was underrated this season, and it was not. You look at Arkansas and Missouri. Both of those teams really underrated this year. When you look at these one-score games, Auburn could have been 7-5. Texas A&M could have been 10-2. This is a team that was 5-7. If they would have found a way to win those close games, remember Alabama, they had the ball right at the goal line. A lot of these games for Texas A&M, they had a chance to win. If they had won them, they could have been 10-2, and it would have been a much different story for the Aggies. And I point back to the youth of this team. If these teams had lost all of their one-score games, LSU would have only been 8-4. Alabama could have been 7-5. That's a big swing from 12-0 to 7-5. That's why I say that Alabama really finished. Their record really does reflect how good they were. They were a 10-2 team this year. Mississippi State 6-6. Still would have made it to a bowl game. Ole Miss could have been 5-7. Same thing with Arkansas. Both of those teams could have had much different years and not even made it to a bowl game if they had lost these close games. Auburn could have been 3-9, and same thing for Texas A&M. So both of these teams, 5-7 was bad, but it could have been even worse for both of them. So how about if these teams split their one-score games? LSU would have been 9-3 still, technically 8.5 and 3.5, but again, we're rounding that up to the closer record to what their actual record was. Alabama 10-2, again, same thing. Mississippi State maybe overrated a little bit. They were more like a 7-5 team. Ole Miss an 8-4 team. Arkansas underrated. Really, they were more like a 7-5 team if they could win maybe one of those close games. Auburn right where they should have been at 5-7, and Texas A&M really was good enough to be 6-6 this year. So that's the big takeaway here is, like I said, Arkansas, Missouri, Texas A&M. Those are teams to potentially watch for next year. And again, this doesn't tell the whole story. We'll have to see what the rosters look like and all of that. But keep an eye on those teams. Watch out maybe for Mississippi State or Tennessee to drop off, because they were pretty good in the one-score games. But nothing really, no team had like a crazy good record in the one-score games. Tennessee would have been the best at 3-0. So we'll see again how this plays out next year. Do you agree with this? Do you think some of these teams, do you think Arkansas was underrated? Like A&M was underrated? Maybe Alabama, Mississippi State were overrated? Give me your thoughts on all this down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more here on the SG1 Sports College Football Channel.